Hey everybody, it's time for my lecture on book one of Aristotle's Nicomachean Ethics. Uh, Typically we just refer to as the Ethics. Um, Nicomachus was Aristotle's son, so presumably the Nicomachean Ethics was named after Aristotle's son. But again, it's typically just referred to as the Ethics. It's the most commonly read of the three main treatises that Aristotle wrote on ethics. There was another one called the Eudemian Ethics and the Magna Moralia. But I think the one that deals with the most central questions about ethics and virtue, virtuous behavior, what kind of life human beings should try and pursue, the Nicomachean Ethics is the one that's typically referred to the most, as the most sort of developed statement of Aristotle on the topic. So let me do a little background here on Aristotle, and then I'll talk about book one. I know book one, it was relatively complex reading. Aristotle's doing a lot of defining of terminology and making distinctions in the terminology that he's using. Trying to explain what he thinks the terminology means, etc. And I know it can get a little complicated, so I'm going to try and help you to get a good overall grasp of the main terminology that Aristotle's using and what he's trying to say using that terminology with book one for today. So when Aristotle was around age 17, he entered Plato's academy, right? Plato's kind of university-like school. First as a student and then later as a teacher. He lived between 384 and 322 BC. And just so you can kind of compare that, Plato was 429 to 348 BC, so you can kind of see where the overlap was there. For 3 years, Aristotle tutored Alexander the Great, which I think I mentioned previously. After Alexander's death, Aristotle had to flee from Athens because obviously, Alexander had no longer had his control on power, and his enemies obviously were allowed to sort of rise up at that point and acquire power. And obviously those people who felt like they were mistreated by Alexander when he was out on his conquests, obviously wanted vengeance, and vengeance against anybody who was an associate of Alexander. Aristotle was one of those people, unfortunately for him. He did eventually start his own school, which he taught in for approximately 12 years, called the Lyceum. So that was, again, the second of the great early kind of university-like schools. And Aristotle sort of continued to an extent, even though his school was a little more formal than Plato's, with something often identified with Plato called being a peripatetic. The word is spelled Peripatetic. Peripatetic or peripatetics is a group where people who kind of walked while thinking. So these weren't lots of people sitting in classrooms for hours at a time. They were often out walking around or out in these stoa or portico walking around, so they were safe from the weather, sort of porch-like entities that were sort of built onto the outside of buildings, so that they were could be out in the fresh air a lot of time as well, and moving around, right, exercising their bodies, right, that Greek notion of healthy body, healthy mind going together, etc. Most of what we have of Aristotle's writings that still exist seem to be notes that he used for his lectures and for these kind of walking discussions that he would undertake with his students. Many of them are still read today. His works on logic, for example, he also did a lot of writing on and was very interested in the arts. So Aristotle's Poetics is a very important piece of his writing, something that I've used a lot in my own writings. In the Poetics, for example, he talks about something that I know I mentioned in discussing Antigone, which is the idea that for something to be considered a piece of drama, especially a piece of tragic drama, it had to have certain formal characteristics, right? It had to have a beginning, a middle, and an end. It had to have a tragic figure who was somebody we were drawn to, but who had a tragic flaw, etc. So he kind of set the requirements for something to be considered a piece of tragic drama, for example, in the Poetics. And of course, for centuries, if you look at the various arts, they're often defined by needing to have certain kinds of formal characteristics to them, whether it be poetry or literature or other kinds of arts, sculpture, painting, etc. Typically, there were kind of forms that you had to fit those into. Aristotle, again, was a realist as opposed to Plato, as we talked about previously. Let me show you here for a second a picture of Aristotle, so you can see what he looked like. Didn't have quite the same flat features that Socrates had. We don't see a lot of references to Aristotle as being sort of unattractive, as we get with Socrates, and even Socrates himself kind of describing himself that way. So that's what Aristotle looked like. And in sort of looking at the differences between Aristotle and Plato, I know that I shared with you previously this portion of the painting, The School of Athens, by Raphael. And again, you see Plato pointing up at the air towards the ideas, towards these forms, as he called them, which were these sort of ultimate ideas, these kind of blueprints for earthly reality where perfection could exist, unlike in everyday reality, and that's where our focus should be on. It should be not just on the life of the mind, but ultimately on sort of contemplation of these ideal forms. Right? We needed to escape from the cave being, physical reality, the natural world, and try and get in contact with, try and understand, try and grasp intellectually these forms. Aristotle, and you can see in this painting, he actually looks pretty similar to that sculpture I just showed you, has his hand more on the ground. It says, no, we need to focus more on the everyday world that we live in, this earthly reality. So Aristotle is much more of a realist. He claimed that there was no existence apart from matter, right, apart from the physical world. So we have Aristotle the realist and Plato the idealist. There are even places in Aristotle's writing, including what we read for today, where he was critical of the forms and said, the forms are ultimately really empty if we just devalue the everyday physical world that we live in. We're ultimately devaluing the forms as well, right? Because those forms really have no meaning apart from some kind of physical instantiation of some kind, right? Apart from some kind of physical reality. So he did definitely realize that, the life of the mind, and thought it was important, and thought things like contemplation were important, but those things needed to be tied to our everyday physical world, right? And rather than trying to grasp, understand this ideal reality apart from any kind of a physical instantiation, right? Apart from any kind of reality as we would typically think of it. And he says, that in this discussion he's going to hold in this piece and in the Nicomachean Ethics, that he's trying to be respectful of Plato, right? He says, certain friends of ours will say, we're focused on this realm of the forms, but we need to, if we think it's necessary, critique what Plato is saying, but be respectful at the same time. And you recognize that might be difficult. This is where you can kind of sense that he's talking to his students here, right? Many of whom will already know Plato's, dialogues, and I'm sure Aristotle also, utilized those. On many things, he did agree with Plato. And so he's trying to be respectful of Plato, and kind of saying to his students that as much as Plato was this great philosopher, is somebody that really helps us, that somebody that whose work we can utilize. By the same token, there are going to be times when we need to critique Plato and move in a different direction, and that he's going to be doing that in his lectures, in his discussions with his students, and want them to just sort of kind of be aware of that. But again, being respectful at the same time. And I think that's important, that we kind of understand that relationship. As much as it is ironic and fascinating at the same time, that again, these two main schools of philosophy come from a teacher and that teacher's student. So at the beginning of book one, and as you probably saw in the syllabus, we're going to be reading just the first 3 books or chapters on the Nicomachean Ethics, though I will refer in a minute to also to book 10, which is the end of the treatise. But books 1, 2, and 3 are what we're going to be really focused on here. And he begins by sort of talking about the way people live their lives in pursuit of something, right? And he talks about that in terms of means and ends. And what he means by means and ends are that, ends are sort of goals. They're aims, things we want to achieve. And means are things we use to achieve those ends, right? So for example, if you want to achieve a certain kind of career, a certain kind of profession, that is an aim or an end. It's a goal that you want to achieve. And there are certain means you have to follow, a certain path you need to take to achieve those goals, right? Education being a part of that, training of some kind, preparation, education, right, to achieve that end that you have. So our lives are kind of made up of these, means and ends. And they're different kinds of ends, though, right? They're sort of, because ultimately, it's how you frame things. When you are thinking about achieving a profession that will take you, let's say, 10 years to achieve. I didn't receive my PhD until I was in my early 30s, for example, and was pretty much in school the whole time from nursery school up through age 32, I think it was, achieving my PhD. If I had viewed that as my end from early in my life, it would have been overwhelming, right? It's hard, especially when you're younger, to have these goals that will take you years to achieve, right? Especially young people, you need to have goals, you need to have aims and ends that are things that you can achieve in a relatively short time, to stay focused on them, to stay motivated, right? One way to define work versus play is that with work, you are using a means to achieve an end that is outside of the work that you're doing, right? You want to achieve a paycheck, let's say, right? And so you have work that you have to do to achieve that paycheck, but that paycheck is something you receive at the end of the day or the end of the week or every 2 weeks, something like that, right? As an adult, it's something you can sort of handle that, right? You can defer that end or that aim of that paycheck. Obviously, when you're younger, you really can't. And one way to define play is that play is an activity where the goal, the aim of the activity is in the activity itself. There's sort of no separation of means and ends there. And it's why play is something that really young people engage in and that we try to make educational for them, right? We try to make their learning fun for them because we want to have that aim or that goal in the activity itself. So a lot of the relationship between means and ends is how you frame things, right? When I was thinking about ultimate goals that I wanted to achieve, there were aims or ends that were along that path to achieving that ultimate goal, right? So I had to get a high school diploma, graduate from college, get my master's degree, and ultimately my PhD, and then get a job, et cetera, so that I could do the kind of work that I do now. Um, and each of those steps were means to the ultimate end of doing what I'm doing now. But I didn't view those as means at the time. I really viewed those things as ends. It would have been too difficult to try and tell myself as I was, taking final exams my sophomore year of college, of imagining that I'd be in school until age 32 to achieve my ultimate goal, right? So I viewed a college education, my master's degree, my high school, degree as ends, as aims that I had, right? Even those weren't ultimate aims. I didn't necessarily realize that at the time. It was only at the end of my undergraduate education that I realized I wanted to pursue a PhD, and that I could actually kind of wrap my head around how much more education I would have to undertake to be able to do that, right? So a lot of times, those things that we have that are really means to some kind of an ultimate end, we view them as intermediate ends or aims or goals, right? So there are sense means and ends at the same time, right? Um, they are intermediate ends or aims. But Aristotle says, ultimately, there's some ultimate, there's some final end or aim that we're all trying to achieve. And he wants us to think about, what that is. Because to talk about ethics, to talk about what is the good life, as it's often put within virtue ethics, we have to think about, what's the ultimate end of life? What's the ultimate goal? What's our aim, right? And to do that, Aristotle says, well, we have to talk about what's the nature of human beings, what's the nature of the reality that we live in, to be able to make that determination, right? And this is where Aristotle, again, is being a realist. Rather than Plato, who, as I said before, seemed to be working with this under this wish, this ultimate desire to achieve our embodiedness and just become disembodied souls or spirits, right? Because again, our bodies are the seat of pain and suffering, and they age and have all these, negative characteristics. Our bodies hold us in a certain place and time that we can imagine. If we can imagine ourselves as a disembodied spirit or soul, we can kind of be everywhere at once. We don't have to think about the pain and suffering of the body, etc. So there's this kind of ongoing wish or desire, a kind of hankering to become disembodied, to somehow escape our bodies. Aristotle says if we want to talk about what human beings can achieve, what our ends and aims are, what virtue is for human beings, we have to talk about the nature of human beings, and we do have bodies, and we do have a physical world that we live in, that we interact with, right? And therefore, we need to understand that physical world and our whole being as human beings, our embodiedness along with, all these other elements. If we're really going to talk realistically about what's the ultimate kind of life to live, what kind of virtue can human beings achieve, right? So he's starting us out on a very different path than Plato would start us out on. So this question about what is the ultimate end, what is the final, goal that we're all trying to achieve, right? And I'm going to put up for you now some terminology that I'll be using for most of the rest of my lecture that will try to touch on the highlights of the terminology that Aristotle's using here to try to piece all of this together, because I know it's complicated. And pretty early on, Aristotle says, he keeps possibilities for what the ultimate end of human life is, and keeps saying, well, this is not quite, this is really these things that we might think of as ends are only means. Wealth, for example, good health, right? He talks about other kinds of things that certainly are things we want to achieve, but they're not the ultimate goal. They're ultimately just means to some, larger goal that's kind of looming out there. And he ultimately lands on this idea of happiness, right? The Greek word is eudaimonia, as I pronounce it in any case. And notice how, in trying to figure this out, Aristotle does something very different than what Plato does. We just talked about Plato and the Crito talking about the one wise person versus the many, right? The crowd versus the people at large. And that we really should focus on what the one wise person says to be on the right path to truth, to understanding, and kind of turn our backs on the crowd and on convention, right? On what most people say, etc. And he did, ultimately recognize there's more than just one wise person, but he's really emphasizing that really wise people are few and far between. And certainly they're not like these sophists who go around with their fancy rhetoric trying to persuade people of things just for power and wealth and not because they really are seeking the truth, right? Aristotle starts out differently. He says, what do reputable people say? What do people who are considered to be thoughtful, who do a good job raising their children, who are, we consider to be wise, fairly well educated, etc. What do they say? So in some ways, he's starting out very differently from Plato here, because he wants to say there are a lot of these people who are reputable that we can look to and see, what do they say? And that's the path that he's going to start to take here to try and answer these questions. So it's these people with reputable opinion that seem to say that happiness or eudaimonia is the ultimate sort of life that we are choosing. It is the final end or aim in life. There's nothing beyond happiness that we are trying to achieve. Wealth, good health, a job, a loving family, friends, right? All of those things are means to the ultimate end of eudaimonia or happiness, as our translation uses for eudaimonia. So that the word for that is endoxa, reputable opinion. It's another term it's helpful to remember, because he's looking to the endoxa to get him on the path to figuring out what the ultimate goal of life is, and he says it's eudaimonia or happiness. Now there are other translations for the word eudaimonia that I actually prefer to happiness. I think happiness can sometimes sound really transient. It can sound kind of superficial, right? We have moments of happiness now and again in our lives. What Aristotle is really ultimately talking here, I think, is something that is larger. It's more robust than that. It is, it's something that's more continuous. We all have moments when we're not happy when we experience pain and suffering, etc. But he wants it to be something that just generally characterizes your whole life, right? And it's kind of an ongoing thing. It's not transient. It's just not tied to the body and physical pleasure. And I think people often conflate pleasure with happiness, right? I kind of prefer the translation human flourishing. There's another translation that you might also prefer even to that, which is living well, right? And I think living well and human flourishing are kind of two ways of saying the same kind of thing, right? But you can see how it's a broader term. It's more inclusive. It speaks more to something that characterizes your whole life and all the different aspects of your life, etc. It necessitates other people, which I think is really important. As I mentioned, I think in a previous lecture, Aristotle says, and even in the book 1 here, he mentions that human beings were made as to be social animals. We were made to be part of a society. We can't ultimately be happy and achieve our potential apart from our relationships with other people, families, and even beyond the family, right? Aristotle talks a lot about potential and actualizing that potential, right? Again, to figure out what the good life is like, what it is to flourish or live well as a human being. We have to figure out what kind of potential we have. And that to do that, we need to figure out, what are human beings like? And then certain kind of things that we will pursue will help us to achieve that potential, to realize that potential, right? We have the potential as human beings to be virtuous or unvirtuous, to be good or bad. Aristotle does not take a hard stance one way or another about human nature, which is something we'll talk a lot about in some later readings, about whether human beings are basically good or bad. He says human beings have the potential to go either direction, right? It depends on the choices you make in your life. It depends on the people that surround you, in particular, the people who are around you when you're young, who really shape your beliefs and your habits when you're really young, your family, friends, other adults. I've also talked about how the laws and how good governance was viewed as hopefully educational for people as well, because it would shape your behaviors and your beliefs. So we need those things to actualize our potential as human beings, but we have the potential to go either way, right? Good or bad. And again, that's his take on human nature. We'll talk more about that with some of the later readings. So we have this kind of pursuit of eudaimonia. An interesting point here. Thomas Jefferson talks about basic rights that we have that I know I talked about previously. Life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness, right? And I may have mentioned that the original is life, liberty, and property. It comes from Locke's second treatise on government. Property is interesting when Locke mentions that, because by property, Locke means your physical body is a part of your property. When Thomas Jefferson writes the Declaration of Independence, he changes life, liberty, and property to life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness. And it's claimed that one reason he did that was because of Aristotle, because Aristotle said that property is only a means to happiness. Happiness is the ultimate goal of human life. So life, liberty, and happiness, and is the slight alteration that Aristotle made to life, liberty, and property. A second possibility there that's sort of interesting to think about is that Locke's second treatise also, and including your own body and talking about property, in that same section of the text, it claims that slavery is a way of controlling another person's body. And basically says slavery is evil. Slavery is a state of war between people because it's one person trying to control another person's body, their physical being. And basically claims that you can't have slavery in the kind of society that Locke is imagining, that he's kind of talking about in this second treatise on government. Had Jefferson went with life, liberty, and property, that would have opened maybe that can of worms where people would have said, hey, well, by property, he means the human body. So are you saying that slavery is not going to be allowed in the colonies and what eventually would become, this new nation? Interesting sort of to think about that. And the way Locke talked about property. It's also been claimed that in a very early version of the Declaration of Independence, Aristotle did have some language condemning slavery that was taken out, and then probably he knew would be taken out, but he felt at least like he had to take some kind of a stance on the issue of slavery, because certainly in his personal life he condemned slavery, even though he owned slaves, had children with at least one of his slaves, claimed that he couldn't economically give up his slaves, etc. That in much of his personal writings, he condemned slavery, but he sort of, as they say, kick the can down the road, leave it to future generations to kind of figure out how to solve the problem of the institution of slavery. I mentioned Jefferson here because very influenced by Aristotle, and not just in Life, Liberty, and Pursuit of Happiness, but there are other ways in which Aristotle influenced Jefferson. So we have two of these terms, eudaimonia and endoxa. Jefferson then talks about what kind of life can one live in the pursuit of happiness, or human flourishing, or living well, depending on your translation for eudaimonia. And he gives some possibilities here. The first one he mentions is a life of pleasure. But he ultimately says, yeah, pleasure is important. You want to have pleasure in your life. However, pleasure tends to be more limited to the body. We identify pleasure with just, bodily satisfaction, and it seems to be more limited to that, or at least most pleasure we identify with our physical bodies. So in kind of leaving out our minds, our intellectual life. Pleasure seems to be awfully transient as something to kind of pursue if you want to be happy. So many things that we consider to be pleasures, if you overdo them, they'll ruin you, right? We typically think about human vices, right? Are kind of pleasures that we might pursue that might be okay in short doses, but you wouldn't want to spend your whole life pursuing those kinds of pleasures because they were not be good for your health and your well-being. We'll talk about probably for next time, Aristotle being one of the promoters of the idea of always following the middle path between extremes, right? So you want to have some pleasure in your life, but you don't want to have too much. But so it can't be the ultimate thing that we are, constantly pursuing as an ultimate end in our life. There were people called Epicureans who were followers of Epicurus, another one of the great Greek philosophers, who did pursue bodily pleasures. Typically people who are just designated as Epicurean are people who really like good food and good wine, other kinds of human pleasures, because they believe that that's how human beings were made to follow nature, and that nature was telling us that we should pursue a life of pleasure. So he had his followers as well. But Aristotle ultimately finds that limiting. Second, he talks about a life of politics. Politics is another one of those terms that's going to be very broadly used here by Aristotle, just as it was for Plato. A life of politics, he means a life of action. And in particular, a life of action in society, including for those people who are going to be certainly leaders in society, politicians, but also adults, right? Role models for young people, parents, teachers, right? Aristotle was very much, again, one of those, it takes a village kind of people, right? That all of society needs to help raise young people, not just one or two people or not just their parents. There needs to be a whole support system for people to really achieve ultimate happiness, to live the good life. So politics is a life of action, right? It's doing things. It's participating. It's developing skills and interests, and pursuing a profession, right? Whatever that might be. And so he's going to focus a lot on that. That's going to be really the main focus of the vast majority of the Nicomachean Ethics. Is what he calls the political life, because he identifies that with a life in pursuit of virtue. It's by acting, it's by our behavior, it's by what we do, what we try to achieve in life, that we either become virtuous or not virtuous as human beings. Thirdly, he mentions the life of contemplation, the philosophical life, right? And this is what Plato was really focused on, right? And Aristotle certainly recognizes that that's important. Again, he does want to see it tethered to physical reality, but he does recognize the value of a life of contemplation. And in fact, in book 10 of the Ethics, the very last book, he talks about that as maybe the ultimate kind of happiness one can achieve is this contemplation, is the intellectual life that Plato talks about. But he does recognize it's not for everybody. And he does recognize you have to have these other things too. You can't just sit around all the time contemplating, great thoughts and great ideas and living in the intellectual life, right? You need to participate in this life of politics, this life in everyday reality as well. So it's going to be politics that he focuses on here. He also talks about the fact that politics does not admit of exactitude. This is a little bit too of a move away from Plato. and some of the more realism of Aristotle. He says different kinds of studies, different kinds of understanding, that with that, we're going to be able to achieve different kinds of exactitude. There are going to be some things we can be very exact about, probably things in physical reality. And again, Aristotle did develop a category system. He did develop a way of organizing plant and animal life. He was a scientist, early scientist, as I've mentioned. And maybe as far as that goes, you can pursue exactitude. But politics deals with human behavior, with human nature, and with how what happens when human nature interacts with a certain kind of everyday world that's also shaped by human beings. It has a human element and a natural element to it, right? There's so many variations there. There's so many different situations we find ourselves in our lives. There's so many different kinds of personalities, right? And that he says politics does not admit of exactitude because of that, right? We're going to try and achieve what degree of truth and of understanding that we can, but it's not going to be a kind of perfection. We're not trying to achieve a Platonic form of the good or of virtue or of the ideal society like Plato's Republic, right? We're going to be much more focused on, again, human beings and everyday reality and the interaction between them. He also talks about the fact that politics is not for youth, not for young people. And maybe some of his students are kind of on the threshold there when he talks about when people are really ready to talk about politics and try and understand it, that they're probably going to be closer to their 20s or maybe even older than that. We know Aristotle started at Plato's Lyceum. It's Plato's academy when he was about 17. So maybe Aristotle's students are maybe either not quite ready to understand politics in a deep way, or they were older, or this topic was for his older students. There are two reasons that he says that politics is not something that youths can really understand. First of all, young people are still driven more by their emotions, right? Certainly more than adults are. You haven't really gotten to the point yet where have you been able to use your rational part of who you are as a human being to fully control and channel your irrational part, right? As Freud would say, you don't have a fully developed ego yet, right? Your id, your natural impulses are still driving your behavior, right? And it's not until you really develop a superego, and that superego can be kind of find that that can work in concert with your id, right? That your ego can help you negotiate between the superego and the id, as Freud would term it, right? So young people are really not ready yet for understanding politics and for being involved in politics, right? People who are involved in politics need to be older than that. The other reason he gives, which is I think an even bigger reason, is they don't have the life experience. You need to have a certain amount of life experience, regardless of how intelligent you are, right? You can be very bright, you can be an intellectual, but you need to have life experience to really be a politician, to be a leader, to help make laws, to be a role model, etc. That takes wisdom, right? Now, no matter how bright you are, you don't achieve wisdom until you've had you lived a certain number of years. And this is something that Plato is going to return to in book 2 and in book 3. That really means that for young people, it's really important that they're in environments that allow them to develop good habits, what Aristotle would call and think about as virtuous habits. because you cannot really reason morally yet, right? Like an adult can, in thinking about complicated decisions, important life decisions, decisions that have a real moral or ethical component to them, have the ability to kind of think through those, to reason about them, right? As we saw Socrates doing with Crito. Aristotle says real young people aren't ready for that yet. They don't have the developed intellect. They don't have the life experience to do that yet, right? So it's important to develop really good habits from a young age. The word that's you'll typically see for habit, and there are several different words that Aristotle uses because he talks about something like habit in a number of different contexts and uses slightly different vocabulary if you look at the original Greek. But hexis is the word that's most frequently used to refer to habit or a disposition, a tendency to act in a certain way, right? Once you develop those, then you can be ready. If those are good habits that you developed, and because you've been in a good environment, a nurturing environment, then you're ready to pursue intellectual life, potentially to be a role model yourself, and an adult family member and somebody in your community and society who's an active participant, right? And somebody people look up to as having reputable opinion, right? So habits really important there. If you take somebody's habits together, they're different kind of behaviors. And notice here that Aristotle means habit in a really broad way. We sometimes think of habits as necessarily bad things, right? They're kind of ruts that you get in. And certainly that can happen. But Aristotle's focusing on habit in a very broad way here. He's thinking about good habits and not just bad habits. But all of our behavior when you're young, when we're really young and living and growing up and not fully mature yet and interacting with this complicated world that we all face when we're young, right? We need to develop good habits and have the tools there to help us to do that. But if you take somebody's habits together, different aspects of their behavior, their disposition, and different life circumstances. And Aristotle's going to talk a lot about different life circumstances, unlike Plato. Because Aristotle will take life circumstances into account in how we judge behavior. All those habits together make up your character. So that's the relationship between habit and character, right? Habits are dispositions, those kind of automatic behaviors or dispositions that we have, tendencies to act in various situations we find ourselves in. Take all those together, make up one's character. Somebody who is really easy to understand, somebody where you think you can predict their behavior, their thoughts, their actions, is somebody who has a lot of habits that are kind of very similar. It may be because they have maybe just a few things that they really pursue in their life, right? They're not broadly interested in a lot of different things. It's really easy to get a bead on them, as we might say, right? Their character is easily definable, understandable. That's somebody whose habits all kind of run in the same direction. They're all interrelated. They seem to be similar. But there are these people that are hard to get a hold on, right? That are hard to really understand. And that might be because they have different habits for different situations, that they're involved in a lot of different kinds of things that take them in different directions. Think about people's politics, right? There might be people whose politics very much run in one direction. And you can predict what their views are going to be on different issues by knowing that they are, let's say, more conservative or more liberal, right? There are, however, right, people who are harder to understand. You can't necessarily predict by looking at their views on a certain political topic, by their view on one topic, and their view on another topic. You can't necessarily predict one from the other. Those people might be likely to be more independent politically, let's say, right? And so you can't necessarily assume that because they have a certain view on one political topic that they have the same views that other people often have who share that same view on other topics, right? So habit and character are really central terms here for Aristotle. The next two books, he's going to talk a lot about habit and a lot about character and how we sort of develop those over time. One more thing I want to talk about here, then I'll get into a little bit more about how we achieve excellence, or arete is the Greek word as I use it here, which includes moral virtue, is the importance for Aristotle, again, of society, of the fact that human beings are social animals, right? There's this Greek word polis that you will see a lot. It was used in Antigone. Certainly Plato used it in the Apology. We saw it. We also saw it in the Crito. And it refers to people, the citizens. And it's also used to refer to the state, because those two are really the same thing here. There's not a real stark division here between people and the state as kind of two independent things. The people constitute the state. They constitute society. They make it up. In particular, the citizens. And remember, the citizens are a subgroup here, right? Typically, they would not include slaves and foreigners, et cetera, who, depending on who you ask, they might not include females and only include males. So it is a subset here. And that's important, I think, to recognize. But when you hear people even today, especially people who are really promoting the necessity, the value of democracy and trying to pursue a democratic way of life, will say that people are the government, right? That people are the state, essentially. And the state, the government, needs to operate with and through the people. It should not act like an independent entity over the people. It takes its power from the people, right, when we talk about a democracy. Right? That's similar, I think, to what Aristotle's talking about here, and to what many Greeks at the time were talking about here when they talk about the people and the state as in a sense, one and the same thing, using that word polis. Another element of that that's important here for Aristotle is that Aristotle really emphasized the good of the individual, of the state, over the good of the individual. Right? Aristotle is often used as an example of what's often called communitarian. Right? Communitarians tend to look at things in terms of communities and the value of community. They tend to argue that to become an individual, to achieve human flourishing, to live well, you cannot do it outside of a social context. And society is necessary for you to fully develop yourself as a human being through things like education and living in a place that has wise laws and wise lawmakers, and where adults are well educated and where they're good role models, etc. Right? Aristotle sometimes talked about it as the father of character education, which is still used in a lot of schools today, sort of because of his emphasis on role models and on adults. So individuals need those things to really become fully realized. You cannot really become a full individual. You cannot achieve your ergon, right? The term I have is number 3 here on the list, your distinctive activity or your essence as a human being. You can't be what you were sort of made to be as a human being without participating in society. Really important for Aristotle. And maybe even sometimes to the extent that you might have to sacrifice certain individual things that maybe you want to achieve, or certain actions. You have to live within laws, right? When I talked about how Plato seemed to be promoting and sort of recognizing the idea of the social contract, I think we see a similar sort of idea here with Aristotle. You give up certain absolute rights when you agree to live in a society, because you realize that you are given things by that society that you would otherwise not have, that are necessary for you to live fully as a human being. but you don't have absolute rights. You can't do whatever you want. And sometimes individuals might need to be sacrificed for the larger good, right? People who are part of the military are willing to give up their life for the society. And remember that, again, Aristotle's writing here very much in the shadow of this Peloponnesian War between Athens and Sparta, where Athens really was largely destroyed. And Aristotle and Plato certainly believed that in part that was because it didn't have the kind of wise leadership it needed to have. So he recognizes the necessity of having a strong, stable society. But a stable society means you have to have wise rulers. For Aristotle and Plato both, and Socrates as well, I would say the same thing, right? To have a really stable society, which is why the focus on ethics and on virtue and on good habits and on bringing young people up the right way and in having reputable opinion among adults who are thoughtful and who are educated and who are really, wanting to do the right thing, not just for themselves, but for other people. So this is where Aristotle really is a communitarian, right? And communitarian certainly has different emphases than political approaches that really put the focus on individual rights and say that are really skeptical of giving up any kind of individual rights for a larger good, because they're worried that human life sort of loses its meaning, its value, if you're having to give up certain kinds of rights for the larger good. So they're more skeptical of doing that. They might want fewer laws, right? They're skeptical of a larger government that might make laws that limit human actions and behaviors. Again, we can talk about masking and all kinds of different kind of things and laws that we have about obeying the speed limit and about things for the health of other human beings, right? You can certainly see people who are maybe more conservative or more libertarian being more on the side of focusing more on individual rights and freedoms, and certainly not comfortable as much going that communitarian direction that Aristotle did. And there's certainly contemporary political thinkers who we might identify as being more liberal, right? Who might be more on the communitarian side of things, right? They want more social programs, strengthen the community, community supports. Think about our history in this country and FDR and the New Deal and the social programs that were developed at that point. Many that were viewed at the time as destructive by conservatives, but that now things like Social Security that now we kind of take for granted. That's a good thing that we have that, et cetera. Right. So lots of interesting political things that are tied up with this. And that's why we read Plato, Aristotle, et cetera, in humanities, and why we see it as valuable part of a liberal arts education, because those things help us to understand issues today that we still have to work with and have to understand and figure out, especially in trying to live in a democracy. Some of these same issues these great Greek political thinkers were dealing with. So I mentioned ergon here, that distinctive activity or essence that everything has. It's kind of what it's made for. So notice that Aristotle does have this kind of assumptions in his thinking. He does think reality is a certain way. The term in philosophy is having a metaphysics. Meta means sort of larger, right? Broader. Physics is talking about sort of reality. So this metaphysics, this nature of reality for Aristotle, we mentioned that he, within that, he's a realist. He believes in everyday physical reality. He's an empiricist, you might say. If you look at the metaphysics of Plato, he's more of an idealist, right? So we kind of have already been using some of these metaphysical distinctions. But Aristotle, within his kind of metaphysics, believes that everything has a purpose. If it exists, it has a purpose. He uses that to develop his category system and trying to understand different kinds of animals, including human beings and plants, and believing that everything kind of fits together. Everything has a purpose. right? We often think about ecosystem or niche when we think about these things, right? Aristotle was on the same track here. He was going in the same direction, I think, is what we might think of today in terms of ecosystem and niche, et cetera. But he believed that everything was kind of created with this, right? He was not a Darwinian, right? He did not believe that these things developed through evolution. He believed that these things were just made, came into being with their distinctive activity, with their essence, with a place in larger reality. So all plant life has a place, it has a role it fulfills, right? In our ecosystem, let's say, to use a sort of more modern term there. And the human beings were also made with this. And to define what this is, Aristotle says, well, what separates human beings from other kinds of animals, other kinds of beings? It's our intellect, right? Our intellect, our rational capacity is the thing that makes us separate from and above other kinds of animal life, right? And it's the thing that makes us most like we think about the gods, or we think about a creator or creators or some higher beings, right? We always think about them in terms of mind or soul or intellect in some way, right? They seem to be these disembodied minds in one way or another. If you look at all the great sort of religious traditions, they kind of exist in a disembodied realm. So what makes us most like them is the fact that we do have minds. We have an intellect, we have a rational capacity. So for human beings to achieve their excellence, arete, they need to pursue their ergon. They need to pursue what they were put on the earth to do, which is more than anything else to develop their intellectual life. Even though Aristotle and the other Greeks really believed, again, this idea of healthy mind, healthy body, ultimately, they were putting more stock in the intellectual life. Certainly philosophers were, right? People like Plato, Socrates, and Aristotle. So ultimately, yes, you need to be healthy in your body. You need to educate the body. It was important for everybody. But in pursuing the good life, it was really more about pursuing a life of the mind ultimately, right? Which involved different kinds of things. It certainly involved philosophy. It involved the liberal arts. It involved literature and music and mathematics and all these kinds of things, right? That we identify with the liberal arts and the liberal arts education. Because those things are how we fulfill our distinctive activity, our ergon as human beings, right? It's our essence as human beings to develop those things as part of developing our minds, our intellects, right? And to do those, to achieve virtue, is to develop those to achieve excellence, right? Including moral virtue, which we'll talk more about in book 2, right? Moral virtue means that you do the right thing in life situations that involve sort of moral decision making of one kind or another. When you're young, you do it out of habit. So moral virtue is all about habits for young people because you don't have the reasoning capacity yet, right, that adults have. You need to do the right thing. And again, to bring it to the point where you're doing it sort of automatically. So we have this, we have ergon here, we have arete, we talked about hexis and habit, about the fact that we have an intellect. And one of the other things, 2 other things I think that are really important to understand here before we get to ultimately defining happiness. The first is that virtue here is used in a very broad sense. When we think about, excellence, arete, and you see the close relationship there in the definition between excellence and virtue. It's anything that you do and you develop to the point of doing it excellent, in an excellent way. is a kind of virtue. So think about the connection between the words virtue and virtuosity. You achieve a kind of virtue when you achieve virtuosity with any kind of life activity, be it in literature, be it in music, be it in athletics, right? And today we use the word virtuosity pretty broadly, right? And you may have wondered, why do we use the word virtuosity that has the same root, obviously, as virtue? Why do we use that word that way? You can trace it back to the Greeks here, right? And this idea of there being a kind of virtue in anything that you develop to the point that we talk about you having virtuosity, right? So you're partaking in virtue not just in particular situations where the moral dimension seems to be dominant, but in any kind of life, activity where that is shaping you as a person, is changing you as a person. Maybe that's changing your habits, your disposition, your abilities, and that might impact other people in some way, like any kind of profession does ultimately, right? Aristotle really recognized, I think, that that it's really hard to separate any human activity from how it's going to impact other people. So this is where this virtuosity connection comes from. The other thing to mention here is that Aristotle, as you know, talks about the connection, talks about the fact that the human soul has both rational and an irrational part. And again, he's going to be doing lots of defining and making distinctions. He says the irrational part has two parts within it, right? One element of the irrational part is sort of the life force. It's the desire for food and procreation and all those things that keep us alive, right? That life force that we understand now often in terms of our survival instinct, right? That many people today would think of maybe in Darwinian terms. So that life force is a part of who we are. And that's necessary. We need to have that. And it's an irrational part because it's something that we are sort of driven to do. There's another element of the irrational part of the soul that deals with what we've already talked about as desire, emotion, passion, those things that young people can be dominated by, which is why Plato did not want the arts in his Republic. He was concerned about young people being driven by their emotions and certain kinds of music and literature and reading material that would, pull them around by their emotions and lead them to act irrationally, etc. Which is where censorship comes in Plato's Republic and lots of other kind of interesting things that, again, as a society, we still try to deal with today. But it is important to also recognize that even though this desire, emotion, and passion is often identified with the body and embodiedness, can be sort of controlled by our irrational part. And it really needs to be for us to be people of reputable opinion, to be people who act virtuously. As we get older, we need to develop our rational capacity, our ability as thinkers, problem solvers, and even as we develop wisdom over time. It really helps us to control our desires, emotion, our passions. It helps us, as Freud would say, in how we act on our desires and our emotions, including things like for food and procreation, sexuality, right? And these human drives that we have that Freud thinks about in terms of the id, right? We need to really develop our intellect, the rational part of who we are. So remember, we got these three parts. First of all, you've distinction between the irrational part and the rational part. The irrational part within itself has two parts. This kind of life force on the one hand, that kind of does its own thing, and desire, emotion, and passion. that we need to be careful about. The second major part is the rational part. That rational part can control our desires, our emotion, our passions. And I think Aristotle would even acknowledge it can also, it needs to be some kind of a control of the life force, even though he doesn't really emphasize that here. But again, I think he would recognize that you don't want, again, this being an Epicurean, he would recognize Epicureans are talking about the life force to the extent that they're talking about the need for food, et cetera, and these kind of things, that these natural drives, but that we can, we need to control those things too. So if we kind of put all this together, we come up with this kind of definition ultimately for happiness or human flourishing that I have at the bottom of the page here. Living well is I use as another translation for eudaimonia. So I've given you three options. Number one, happiness. Number two, human flourishing. Or number three, living well. And to achieve that is an activity of the soul in accordance with virtue. In other words, you are pursuing the human ergon, a life of rational action and behavior, of thoughtfulness, ultimately of wisdom, to the point of achieving excellence, arete, right? Which, in other words, is achieving achieving virtue in different kinds of ways. Moral virtue ultimately is what he's talking about here. But we also said that it means other kinds of virtues and virtuosity too in your profession, right? How you rear your children, all these kind of things, right? That's how you flourish as a human being. You do the kind of things human beings were made to do. You do them to the point of excellence or virtuosity, right? Including moral virtue. That is what is a life of happiness or human flourishing for human beings. Next time in book 2, we'll talk a little more about some of the things that are important. He'll make some more distinctions. He'll talk about what is voluntary versus involuntary behavior. He'll get into lots of details about particular life situations that become really important. He'll get into moral judgment, how and when we can judge people's behavior. And so look out for those things in reading book 2. I'll pick up on those things when I do my next lecture, which will be along with book 3. I'll try to hit on the highlights from book 2 and also talk about obviously some of the things Aristotle talks about in book 3. Remember to be working on your papers. Look at the different paper topics that I have given you as options. If you have any questions, as always, send me an email. If something that is seems to be need more beyond than just what an email can provide or an email interchange, let me know. We can set up a Zoom meeting. I've already done it with some of you to talk about papers or paper topics or any other things. Hope you find that helpful. Try to touch on the highlights here. And I'll see you again in the next lecture. If not sooner, through some other forum, through email or Zoom, just let me know. And I'll talk to you again soon.